As president of Uganda from 1971 to 1979, Idi Amin, circa 1925, became well known for his terrible violations of human rights, for causing the collapse of the country's economy, and for causing social disorganization. Amin is remembered best as the tyrant of Uganda who was responsible for a reign filled with mass killings and disorder. Idi Amin Dada was born sometime between 1925 and 1927 in Kiboko, West Nile Province, in Uganda. His father was a Kakwa, a tribe that exists in Uganda, Zaire, now Congo, and Sudan. As a boy, Amin spent much time tending goats and working in the fields. He embraced Islam and attained a fourth-grade education. He was brought up by his mother, who abandoned his father to move to Lugazi, Uganda. As Amin grew, he matched the qualifications for military service desired by the British at that time. He was tall and strong. He spoke the Kiswahili language. He also lacked a good education, which implied that he would take orders well. Joining the army as a private in 1946, Amin impressed his superiors by being a good swimmer, rugby player, and boxer. In 1946, he joined Britain's colonial African troops known as the King's African Rifles, and served in Burma, Somalia, Kenya, during the British suppression of the Mau Mau, and Uganda. Although he was considered a skilled soldier, Amin developed a reputation for cruelty and was almost cashiered on several occasions for excessive brutality during interrogations. Nevertheless, he rose through the ranks, reaching Sergeant Major before finally being made an Effendi, the highest rank possible for a black African serving in the British Army. Amin was also an accomplished athlete, holding Uganda's light heavyweight boxing championship title from 1951 to 1960. As Uganda approached independence, Amin's close colleague Apollo Milton Obote, the leader of the Uganda People's Congress, UPC, was made chief minister and then prime minister. Obote had Amin, one of only two high-ranking Africans in the KAR, appointed as first lieutenant of the Ugandan army. Sent north to quell cattle stealing, Amin perpetrated such atrocities that the British government demanded he be prosecuted. Instead, Obote arranged for him to receive further military training in the UK. On his return to Uganda in 1964, Amin was promoted to major and given the task of dealing with an army in mutiny. His success led to a further promotion to colonel. In 1965, Obote and Amin were implicated in a deal to smuggle gold, coffee, and ivory out of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. A parliamentary investigation demanded by President Edward Mutebi Mutesa II put Obote on the defensive. Obote promoted Amin to general and made him chief of staff, had 5 ministers arrested, suspended the 1962 constitution, and declared himself president. Mutesa was forced into exile in 1966 after government forces, under the command of Amin, stormed the royal palace. Idi Amin began to strengthen his position within the army using the funds obtained from smuggling and from supplying arms to rebels in southern Sudan. He also developed ties with British and Israeli agents in the country. President Obote first responded by putting Amin under house arrest. When this failed to work, Amin was sidelined to a non-executive position in the army. On January 25, 1971, while Obote was attending a meeting in Singapore, Amin led a coup d'état, taking control of the country and declaring himself president. Amin was initially welcomed both within Uganda and by the international community. Political prisoners, many of whom were Amin followers, were freed and the Ugandan secret police was disbanded. At the same time, however, Amin formed killer squads to hunt down Obote's supporters. Obote took refuge in Tanzania, from where, in 1972, he attempted unsuccessfully to regain the country through a military coup. Obote's supporters within the Ugandan army, predominantly from the Akoli and Lango ethnic groups, were also involved in the coup. Amin responded by bombing Tanzanian towns and purging the army of Akoli and Lango officers. The ethnic violence grew to include the whole of the army, and then Ugandan civilians, as Amin became increasingly paranoid. The Nile Mansions Hotel in Kampala became infamous as Amin's interrogation and torture center, and Amin is said to have moved residences regularly to avoid assassination attempts. His killer squads, under the official titles of State Research Bureau and Public Safety Unit, were responsible for tens of thousands of abductions and murders. Amin personally ordered the execution of the Anglican Archbishop of Uganda, the Chancellor of Makerere College, the Governor of the Bank of Uganda, and several of his own parliamentary ministers. Idi Amin declared what is known as the «economic war» in 1972. This decision was part of a series of policies aimed at strengthening Ugandan control over the country's economy and ridding it of foreign influences, particularly British and Indian. In August 1972, Amin issued an order expelling approximately 60,000 people of Asian descent, mostly Indians, from Uganda. This group formed the backbone of the country's economy, owning and operating most of the small and medium-sized businesses. Amin gave the Asian community 90 days to leave the country, stripping them of their properties and livelihoods, which were then seized by the Ugandan government. The Ugandan government decided to nationalize many foreign-owned companies and assets. This policy targeted businesses and commercial interests owned or managed by foreign communities, especially the British and Asians. After seizing these properties, they were redistributed to Ugandans. The goal of this step was to build a class of Ugandan entrepreneurs and encourage local economic empowerment. Amin attempted to implement economic policies aimed at making Uganda self-sufficient. This included promoting local agriculture and industry and trying to reduce dependence on imports. Despite the intention to bolster Uganda's economy, the economic war had a generally negative impact. The expulsion and expropriation process led to a significant shortage of expertise and skills necessary for running businesses, causing many economic sectors to collapse. Uganda's relations with other countries were significantly affected. The expulsion led to strained relations with the United Kingdom and India, in addition to deteriorating relations with some other African nations that hosted the expelled Asian communities. The economic war weakened Uganda's internal stability. Amin's policies led to increased corruption and inefficiency in government administration, resulting in widespread economic and social disruptions. Domestically, Amin's policies led to increased corruption and inefficiency in government administration. This resulted in deteriorating public services and rising unemployment and poverty rates. The situation was exacerbated by heightened political repression and arbitrary arrests, creating an atmosphere of fear and instability among the population. All these factors contributed to an unstable environment where corruption was rampant, and the absence of law and order became commonplace. As economic and social conditions deteriorated, opposition to Idi Amin's regime grew. Rebel groups and internal opposition emerged, along with increasing international pressure on Amin's regime. Amin attempted to maintain his grip on power through violent repression but could not quell the growing discontent among the populace. In the early 1970s, after taking power in Uganda, Idi Amin sought international allies to support his new regime. At that time, Muammar Gaddafi, who had come to power in Libya in 1969, was looking to expand his influence in Africa and the Islamic world. Both leaders saw each other as strategic allies in achieving their shared goals. One of the most notable aspects of this relationship was the financial and military support Gaddafi provided to Amin. Libya provided substantial financial aid to Uganda, helping Amin's regime maintain internal stability and develop some economic projects. Additionally, Libya supplied Uganda with weapons and military training. Libyan forces helped train the Ugandan military, increasing its capabilities to handle internal and external threats. The relationship between Amin and Gaddafi went beyond military and financial support. Both leaders opposed Western colonialism and American influence in Africa. They adopted anti-imperialist rhetoric and sought to promote African unity and cooperation between African and Arab countries. Gaddafi, who dreamed of establishing a United States of Africa, found in Amin an ally who could contribute to achieving this goal. When Idi Amin announced the expulsion of the Asian community from Uganda in 1972, he faced widespread international criticism. During these difficult times, Gaddafi was among the few leaders who expressed support for Amin's decisions. Libya provided Uganda with political and diplomatic support, helping Amin withstand international pressure and isolation. In return, Idi Amin supported Gaddafi's policies on the international stage. During African summits and international conferences, Amin advocated for Libya's positions and promoted Gaddafi's views on various issues. Amin also sought to strengthen relations between Uganda and other Arab countries, benefiting from his strong relationship with Gaddafi. However, the relationship between Amin and Gaddafi was not without tensions. There were occasional disagreements over regional and international issues, but both leaders recognized the importance of maintaining their strategic alliance. In 1978, Idi Amin made the disastrous decision to invade Tanzania, a move that had severe repercussions for his regime and Uganda as a whole. This decision came in the context of Amin's attempts to distract attention from the worsening internal crises in Uganda, where the country was suffering from a deepening economic collapse and political turmoil. There were also long-standing border disputes between Uganda and Tanzania, which Amin used as a pretext for the invasion. The crisis began when Amin accused Tanzanian forces of launching cross-border attacks and supporting Ugandan rebels. In October 1978, Amin ordered his army to invade the Tanzanian region of Kagera, seizing a portion of the border territory. Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere responded swiftly and decisively to this aggression. Tanzania not only had a strong and well-organized military, but it also enjoyed political support from the international community. Initially, the Ugandan forces made some gains, but the situation quickly changed. The Tanzanian army, supported by Ugandan rebels, launched a powerful counteroffensive. The Tanzanian forces were better equipped and trained, and they soon outmatched the Ugandan forces. By April 1979, Tanzanian forces and their allies had overrun the Ugandan capital, Kampala, leading to the collapse of Idi Amin's regime and his flight into exile. The consequences of the invasion of Tanzania were devastating for Uganda and for Amin's regime. Firstly, the invasion led to significant destruction of Uganda's infrastructure and further exacerbated the economic chaos. The Tanzanian forces and Ugandan rebels, after toppling Amin, faced significant challenges in rebuilding the country and restoring order. Secondly, Uganda lost a substantial portion of its military forces and equipment during the conflict, weakening the country's military capabilities for a long time. Thirdly, politically, the fall of Amin ushered in a period of instability in Uganda. Power returned to Milton Obote, who had been president before Amin, but his second term was fraught with challenges. Internal conflicts and political violence continued for years, making the state rebuilding process slow and difficult. Fourthly, internationally, Tanzania's image improved significantly due to its successful intervention against Amin. Tanzania received international support and commendation for its role in ousting one of Africa's most brutal dictators. The attempt to invade Tanzania was one of the most catastrophic decisions in Idi Amin's rule. This move not only led to the downfall of his regime but also left Uganda in a state of chaos and turmoil that persisted for years after his departure. Following Amin's fall, Uganda slowly began to recover and rebuild under new leadership, but the impacts of his disastrous rule and the invasion of Tanzania remain palpable in the country's modern history. Amin fled to Libya, where he had strong connections with Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. He spent some time there, but his stay in Libya was not long-lasting. Later, he moved to Iraq, where he received temporary support from Saddam Hussein. However, his stay in Iraq was also brief. Eventually, Amin found a permanent haven in Saudi Arabia, which granted him asylum under strict conditions that he remain out of public sight and refrain from any political activities. He settled in the city of Jeddah, where he lived a relatively quiet life away from the public eye. The Saudi government provided him and his family with a home and financial support but kept him under strict surveillance to ensure he did not engage in any political activities. In exile, Idi Amin led a life removed from politics and public events. Despite not publicly acknowledging any wrongdoing during his rule in Uganda, there were reports suggesting that he showed no remorse for the atrocities and abuses he committed. Idi Amin died on August 16, 2003, at the King Faisal Specialist Hospital in Jeddah due to kidney failure. His death came after a prolonged period of illness and health complications. He was buried in a modest grave in Ruwais Cemetery in Jeddah, far from his native Uganda, which was still grappling with the legacy of his brutal rule years after his regime had fallen. Amin's brutal reign has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and dramatic films, often depicted in his time as an eccentric buffoon with delusions of grandeur. Amin is now considered one of history's cruelest dictators. Historians believe his regime was responsible for at least 100,000 deaths and possibly many more.